The night was unusually quiet, and the house felt even more still than normal. I had taken my usual sleeping pills, the ones that helped me unwind after long days. But the lights dimmed. I slowly made my way to bed, feeling the medication starting to take effect. I had no idea what was about to happen, and nothing could have prepared me for it. As I lay beneath the soft blankets, my mind gradually released the day's stresses, and I fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Little did I know that something strange was unfolding within the house. Earlier that evening, my stepson and two of his friends had come over. They were older teens, just a few years apart, and they frequently spent time together here, laughing, joking, and sometimes getting a bit too noisy for my liking. I never thought much of it. They were just kids having fun. I trusted them, especially my stepson, who had always been polite and respectful, though I had noticed he was growing more independent. What I didn't realize was that this night would be different for them. As I fell deeper into my slumber, under the strong effects of the pills, the three boys downstairs were engaged in a hushed conversation. Something was happening, something beyond anything I could have imagined. They had been drinking, and the mood had shifted. Fueled by alcohol, my stepson suggested something reckless, something outrageous. His friends, caught up in the excitement, eagerly went along with it. Midnight came, and the house remained silent, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floors. I was completely oblivious to the events unfolding just outside my bedroom door. The three boys had devised a plan, one that would alter everything. I stirred slightly in my sleep, vaguely aware of a presence nearby, but my body felt heavy from the pills, and I could barely register the sensation. A door creaked open, but my eyes stayed shut as if it were part of a distant dream. They entered the room cautiously, their movements quiet. My stepson led the way, with his two friends nervously following behind him. This was uncharted territory for them, but an odd tension in the air seemed to drive them forward, even as they hesitated. The room was dimly lit, with a faint glow from the streetlights slipping through the blinds. I lay on my back, completely unaware of their presence. My breathing was slow and deep as I remained lost in sleep. My stepson approached, his heart racing. He had thought about this moment for a long time, but now that it was happening, it felt unreal. His friends watched closely, waiting for him to make the first move. They whispered among themselves, excited yet anxious. They had drunk enough to push them past the point of no return, but they were fully aware of their actions. They knew this was something that could never be undone. Slowly, my stepson extended his hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he touched my arm. It was a light touch, so gentle that I didn't wake up. The sleeping pills had done their job, and I remained in a deep, dreamless state. But in that brief moment, everything shifted. His friends moved closer, their eyes wide as they observed him. It felt like a scene from a movie, unreal yet all too real. The excitement and tension in the air were overwhelming. They were caught up in the thrill of doing something forbidden, something they knew was wrong. My stepson leaned over me, his breath quick and shallow, whispering something to his friends. They nodded, their hearts pounding, as they positioned themselves on either side of the bed. So one of them glanced at my face, perhaps wondering if I would wake up. But I remained still, too deep in sleep to sense anything. What happened next was a blur of emotions and sensations, a whirlwind none of us could have foreseen. So my body, unresponsive in the moment, became their focus. The boys, driven by their own desires and the intoxicating thrill of the situation, let themselves get carried away. Time seemed to stretch out as they followed through with their plan, each of them lost in the fantasy they had constructed in their minds. It was something they had joked about in the past, never imagining it would actually come to pass. Yet here they were, crossing lines they couldn't undo. As the minutes ticked by, they grew bolder, their actions more daring, and the distinction between right and wrong faded away. They no longer cared about the consequences. They were too far in now. Their hands, once hesitant, moved with newfound confidence, spurred on by the rush of the moment. My stepson, still leading the way, glanced at his friends with a mischievous grin. They were in this together, and at that moment, nothing could stop them. Now they were caught in a wave of excitement, an intense rush unlike anything they had ever experienced. But then, something changed. One of the boys, usually quieter, began to feel a sense of guilt. He looked over at me, lying there peacefully, and something shifted inside him. He hadn't expected to feel this way, but now that they were in the middle of it, he wasn't sure if he could go on. He nudged my stepson and whispered that maybe they should stop, that maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. But my stepson was too lost in the moment, too swept up in the intensity to care. He shrugged off his friend's concern, determined to continue. The other boy, caught between his own desires and the growing unease of his friend, felt uncertain. He wanted to keep going but could sense the tension building in the room like a ticking time bomb. He didn't know how much longer they could continue before something went wrong. Then, just as they were about to take things further, I stirred. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it sent a shock of panic through the room. My Stepson froze, his heart pounding as he watched me. Though I hadn't woken up, the slight shift in my body was enough to make them all pause for a moment. The room fell silent, the tension thick in the air. They held their breath, waiting to see if I would wake up, but the sleeping pills still held me in their grip, and I remained deeply asleep, unaware of everything happening around me. Relieved but shaken, they withdrew, their excitement now mingled with fear. What had begun as a wide idea, a thrilling adventure, was now spiraling out of control. My Stepson exchanged glances with his friends, his expression difficult to read. They had crossed a line and all of them knew it. Finally, the boy who had spoken up earlier said what they were all thinking: we should stop. This isn't right. His voice was quiet, but the words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. My Stepson hesitated, his thoughts racing. He knew his friend was right, but part of him didn't want to stop the thrill, the adrenaline. It was addictive. Deep down, he knew they had gone too far. He looked at me again, still asleep, and something inside him shifted. Slowly and reluctantly, he nodded. They had to end it. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The excitement was gone, replaced by a creeping sense of guilt and regret. They had pushed things too far, and there was no undoing it. Without speaking, they quietly slipped out of the room, their footsteps barely audible as they retreated to the living room. The house was silent once more, and I remained blissfully unaware of what had just occurred. In the living room, the weight of what they had done settled over them. No one spoke, the silence thick with unspoken thoughts. My Stepson stared at the floor, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. What had they been thinking? How had it come to this? His friends sat beside him, equally lost in their own thoughts. The fun, the thrill of the moment had long since faded. All that remained was a lingering sense of unease. The morning came, and I woke up feeling groggy, the effects of the sleeping pills still lingering in my system. I had no clue what had happened during the night, no idea that anything unusual had occurred. To me, it had been another peaceful night's rest. But for my Stepson and his friends, everything had changed. The weight of their actions hung over them, a constant reminder of how close they had come to going too far. They tried to act normal, to pretend that nothing had happened, but the tension between them was impossible to ignore. As the days went by, the memory of that night stayed with them, a secret they couldn't escape. My Stepson and his friends started visiting less often. Their usual laughter and rowdy behavior were replaced by awkward silences and uneasy glances. I noticed the change but didn't question it. In my mind, it was just a phased teenagers acting strangely for reasons I might never fully understand. What I didn't realize was the internal struggle they were each facing. My Stepson, in particular, found it difficult to look me in the eye. Every time he saw me, guilt gnawed at him. His friends felt the same. They had once shared a bond of fun and mischief, but now that connection was tainted by something darker. The tension between them was almost palpable. One afternoon, as I was cleaning the house, I came across an old photo of my Stepson and his friends. They looked younger, carefree. It struck me how much had changed. I didn't understand the full meaning of that shift at the time, but I could sense something wasn't quite right. Stepson became more distant than usual, and his friends rarely came by. When they did, they seemed nervous, as though they were walking on eggshells around me. So I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened, something they weren't telling me, but I'd brushed it off, thinking it was just part of them growing up, finding their own way. I trusted my Stepson, even though he was acting strangely. But deep down, I started to wonder if I had missed something important. Weeks passed, and I began to notice more subtle changes in my Stepson's behavior. He spent more time alone and avoided eye contact when we spoke. His friends seemed different too, especially the quieter one, who could barely look at me without a guilty expression crossing his face. It was as if he wanted to say something but was too afraid of the consequences. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I lay awake, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't fully grasp. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't quite figure out what it was. I replayed the past few weeks in my mind, trying to pinpoint when things had started to feel off. Then it hit me the night I'd taken the sleeping pills. It seemed like any other night, or so I believed at the time, but the way my stepson and his friends have been behaving since then made me start to wonder, could something have happened while I was asleep? The thought seemed ridiculous at first, but the more I dwelled on it, the more it demurred at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. My instincts told me that whatever had changed between my stepson and his friends had started that night. But how could I be sure? They were acting so strangely, yet none of them had said a word to me. The next day, I decided to talk to my stepson. It wasn't easy. I wasn't sure how to bring it up without sounding paranoid, but I couldn't ignore the persistent feeling that something had happened that night, something I needed to understand. Is everything okay? I asked him one evening when we were alone in the kitchen. He looked up from his phone, startled, like he hadn't expected the question. Yeah, why? He replied, a bit too quickly. You've been acting differently lately, I said, trying to keep my tone light. You and your friends. Is something going on? For a moment, he just stared at me, wide-eyed, like a deer caught in headlights. And just as quickly, he looked away, avoiding my eyes. No, everything's fine, he muttered, but there was a tremble in his voice. I didn't push it, not yet, but I knew he wasn't telling me the whole truth. I decided to drop it for the moment, hoping that eventually he'd feel comfortable enough to come clean. As the days went by, I kept a closer watch on him and his friends, searching for any signs that might explain what had happened. My stepson remained distant, and his friends stopped coming by as often. It was clear that something was eating away at them, and I was determined to figure out what it was. Then, one evening, everything changed. It was late, and I was sitting in the living room flipping through a magazine when I heard a knock at the door. Standing there was one of my stepson's friends, the quiet one, the one who always seemed the most uncomfortable around me. He looked pale, his hands trembling as he stood on the doorstep. Can I talk to you? He asked, his voice barely audible. I nodded and stepped aside to let him in. He sat down on the couch, his head in his hands, as though he was wrestling with something inside. I need to tell you something, he said, his voice shaking. About that night when you took the sleeping pills. My heart started racing as I sat across from him. I had sensed something was wrong, but hearing him say it made it real. What happened? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he began to explain. We did something we shouldn't have, he admitted. He went on to describe how they had entered my room while I was asleep, led by my stepson, and how they had gotten swept up in something they couldn't control. His voice was full of regret, and I could see the guilt on his face. Didn't want to go along with it, he said, tears filling his eyes, but I didn't know how to stop it. As he spoke, a flood of emotions overwhelmed me: shock, anger, disbelief. I struggled to process what he was telling me. My stepson, the boy I trusted, had betrayed me in a way I never could have imagined. When he finished talking, there was a long, heavy silence. I didn't know what to say or how to feel. The room seemed to close in around me, the weight of his confession pressing down like a heavy blanket. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. I don't know how to make it right. I sat there, stunned, trying to make sense of everything. My mind was racing, and a knot of anger tightened in my chest, but at the same time I felt a strange sense of relief that I finally knew the truth, that I hadn't been imagining things. After what felt like an eternity, I stood up. Thank you for telling me, I said quietly. He nodded, wiped away his tears, and left the house. I watched him walk away, my heart pounding as I tried to figure out what to do next. The truth was out, but it had left me broken. I couldn't look at my stepson the same way anymore. Everything had changed, and I didn't know how to move forward from there. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep, the weight of what had happened suffocating me. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, betrayal, confusion. I had trusted my stepson, and he had shattered that trust in the worst possible way. The next morning, I confronted him. I told him what his friend had confessed, and at first he denied it. But eventually the guilt became too much for him to bear, and he broke down, admitting everything. I'm sorry, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I don't know why we did it. I didn't have the words to respond. I wasn't sure if I could ever forgive him. The bond between us had been destroyed, and I didn't know if it could ever be repaired. In the end, I decided to send him away, to give myself the space I needed to heal. It was one of the hardest decisions I had ever made, but I knew it was the right one. As time went on, I tried to move past what had happened, but the memory of that night stayed with me. It was a scar that would never fully heal, a constant reminder of the betrayal I had endured. But I also learned something important, that sometimes the people you trust the most can hurt you in ways you never imagined. And while the pain may never completely fade, you can find the strength to move forward, to rebuild your life piece by piece. It wasn't easy, but over time I found my way back to myself. In the end, that was all I could do.